is that loud? Thank you so much for joining us on a Wednesday night. I know it's after a long day of work for pretty much everyone, and it's a real privilege to have you all here today. My name is Avril England. I am the General Manager of Viva Vault, which is a software platform and set of applications here at Viva. I'll talk about that in a second. But really tonight, of course, is not at all about Viva. It's really about our opportunity to host such a wonderful industry event. Thank you to Emanate for their work in the collaborations on clinical research. What a nice opportunity for like-minded people to get together and talk about important issues and challenges that face the industry. We couldn't be more pleased to sponsor, so thank you for that. Glad you could all be here. I'll do just a couple of brief moments about Viva, and then I'm going to turn it over to Terry, who's going to MC the rest of the night. Or you can click for me. All right, so who is Viva? Viva is a software company that does software as a service. We were founded in 2007, which is a little bit over 10 years ago, founded here in Pleasanton by a local entrepreneur, Peter Gassner, focused entirely on life sciences. And in fact, in our early days, we were focused only on delivering basically CRM for life sciences on the Salesforce platform. Peter was ex-PeopleSoft, had been at Salesforce and said, there's an opportunity to do verticalized CRM solutions, and we think that life sciences is a specifically interesting place where we could start. And after getting started in life sciences, we realized we didn't need to go anywhere else. There's plenty to do in life sciences. About 4 or 5 years in, so about 6 years ago, it became obvious that there was more to life sciences than strictly the commercialized side of the business and how the sales and marketing teams operated with the doctors and the like. And there was an opportunity to introduce a development side or an R&D side to the life sciences offering that Viva has, and that's actually where the Viva Vault platform came from, which is what I'm responsible for today. We have over 600 customers and over 2,000 employees, and we're in over 165 countries worldwide, but we're fortunate enough to be headquartered right here. Couldn't ask for it to be better. Our development cloud or our product suite, I put up there for your reference, but actually we're not here to talk about it at all tonight. If you have any questions at all about anything that Viva does, we've left a little sign-up sheet at the back. Rather than try and talk about it here, let's talk about tonight's topics, which is, of course, adverse events and EDC. And if you want anyone from Viva to follow up with you about any of these products, which I'll talk about briefly, please just leave your name and contact information. We're really good at following up. One of our core values is speed. We're organized on the development cloud in terms of some key pillars. You can see clinical data management, which is our EDC solution. We have clinical operations, of which I have Steve Harper and Sandra Pepe here responsible for that product line. We have a quality product line, SOPs, work instructions, quality management systems. We have a RIM, or Regulatory Information Management suite of products. And we're currently today not in production, but in development with our safety suite of products. So particularly pertinent for tonight, but not ready at any rate. So I won't spend any time there at all. I'm going to turn it over to Terry. Thank you again for joining us. We're really pleased you could be here and that we could sponsor. Thanks, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Avril. So we're quite excited to be here tonight. Emanate Life Sciences has our mission to help our clients bring products to market and improve people's lives, basically. As a data management functional service provider, we provide both full service and contract consulting. So we are out there to help our clients bring those products to market. Additionally, Emanate, we do consulting services that can help your study teams implement clinical trial imaging and endpoint adjudication solutions. We are located in Scotts Valley, and we have many clients in the Bay Area, and it's fun to have our position and our event tonight on this side of the Bay Area. We've done a couple at HP, and so we try and hit both sides of the Bay, and so we appreciate all of you being here, and we also appreciate Viva. It's a beautiful location, and we just appreciate their partnership. I get the opportunity to introduce our speakers tonight. Both of them come with a wealth of knowledge from the industry, and so we're very thankful that they're here tonight. First is Bethany. Bethany Van Veen has been in drug safety and pharmacovigilance for more than 19 years, including 17 years in PV management in both large and small companies. About 5 years ago, she began a consulting business providing strategic PV advice to Bay Area pharmaceutical companies, as well as business process optimization, QMS, alliance management, and PV audits. Prior to this, Bethany was the Senior Director of Safety Operations at Intermune, where she was responsible for the case management unit, QMCS, PV informatics, alliance management, and post-authorization safety studies. She also held leadership positions at Johnson & Johnson, Millennium Pharmaceuticals, and Elan Pharmaceuticals. Bethany also is an adjunct professor at San Francisco State University, teaching the safety monitoring course for the clinical trials design and management certification. So we're excited to have Bethany here tonight. Our second speaker was to be Gina Budman, but unfortunately her father passed away last week. And so she won't be able to be here tonight, but we're very thankful that Hajime Arnold, another industry expert, is going to be able to step in and do his presentation. Hajime actually has an unyielding passion for the life science industry, which came early in his career when he worked on a product that actually saved his best friend's life. So how's that for getting close to the product? About 2 years ago, Hajime founded Emanate Life Sciences to support small and mid-sized companies with their clinical trials. He enjoys sharing his knowledge and experience to support other life science organizations. Prior to Emanate, he founded Chrysalis Insight, an analytics platform supporting protocol development and site selection activities based on electronic health records. Hajime has worked for various industry leaders such as Guidant, Abbott Vascular, Onyx Pharmaceuticals, and Amgen. He has held various positions including clinical operations, data management, safety, and medical affairs. Hajime currently serves on the PAMF, which is the Palo Alto Medical Foundation's community board. He holds a bachelor's degree in organizational behavior and leadership from the University of San Francisco. So Hajime, do you want to come up and start a presentation? Do you want this one? Okay.
So I guess tonight what I want to talk about is we want to talk about the complexity of kind of AE review. And then I think the other component of our objective is really to start talking about technologies, what's available, what's not available. So when we go to the doctor, I get to the doctor and the first thing I do, I pull up in the parking lot. I'm always late. I run into the place, I get to the receptionist up front. Receptionist is like, okay, fill out this form. Here's all the information. You pull it up. It has your medical history. They say, do you got any new information you want to put, any new medications, and so forth. I'm sitting there in a chair, still filling things out, and then the nurse calls out and they go, hey, Hodge, are you here? I'm like, yeah, and I follow him in. And then I got to go step on that stupid scale, right? And I never weigh myself until I have to actually get on that scale. And I'm like holding my breath. I'm taking my cell phone out of my pocket, like anything I'm holding because I don't want anything extra, right? And then after that, I follow the nurse into the room, the patient room, and she goes, okay, we got to check your oxygen. And they stick that little oxygen meter on your finger, and they stick the thermometer in your mouth. And then I'm secretly hoping, like, okay, am I at 100% oxygen this time? Because I don't want to be at 0, right? Because that means I'm dead, right? And so we're going through all this, and she goes back, and she always is at her computer at this point, and she's like, okay, so the medications, and she reads the medication list down to me, and I'm like, yep, I'm still on one of those. I'm like, no, that's my allergy pill. I don't like that allergy pill anymore, right? And then we go through that, and she says, okay, the doctor will be here for a few minutes. And so I sit down, and I'm ready. I'm like, okay, so this is probably going to be at a 5 to 10 minute wait. Pull out your cell phone. I start playing a game. Doctor comes in, right? And they're like, how are you feeling on that new medication? I'm like, I'm feeling okay now, but I got dizzy. It was hard to breathe, and I have this rash also, but I think it's fine. I just stopped. And then he goes, when did that happen? And I'm like, when I started it, and they'll be, okay, and is it still ongoing? I'm like, no, it stopped about a couple days ago. And then we kind of go through the process, and he does my breathing and all the vital signs all over again. So in this interaction, there's a lot of things that are happening when we're talking about clinical trials, right? When you're filling out that medical history, and we're talking about in database, we're filling out the medical history form. When they're talking to us about our medication, that's the medications CRF, right? When they're talking to us about our blood pressure, our weight, all that, that's vital signs. It's going on to the vital signs form, right? And then I got this whole new issue coming up. There's a problem, right? And so I go, oh, I got a problem. All of a sudden, that's an adverse event, right? And so they're starting to feel out, okay, what happened with your adverse event? Is it ongoing? Has it started? Has it stopped? And they're probing to find out additional information. That's all kind of happening when we're sitting in our doctor's office, and we just think that the doctor's seeing us, and I'm trying to leave, right? And so this is what is happening. But when we start talking about adverse events, once an adverse event comes in, I think it's important to think about is, where does that adverse event go, right? It's going to go, if it's a serious adverse event, it's going to go to the pharmacovigilance team. If it's also that adverse event, it's going to go to your medical monitor so that they can review all the adverse events. That adverse event is going to go to your coding team, right? Because we have to make sure that everything is in a standardized language. And then depending upon the type of study or event that it is, you might also have a clinical events committee, right? So this adverse event really goes to different locations, even though when we talk about it, sometimes we think of it as just an AE, right? And so with that, kind of thinking about this, because this is probably the workflow most of you guys have, is AE gets entered into EDC. We ask on that AE form, was it serious? And then all of a sudden, magically, an email notification will get sent to the pharmacovigilance team or your equivalent thereof, right? Someone's going to review that case, ask for information, and then send it over and put it into the safety database. Safety database is different from EDC, right? So it's a second database. And so at the end, at some time during that study, we now have to make sure that whatever's in our safety database and what's in our EDC database is the same. We're not even talking about when someone actually calls in on the safety database, then they're part of a clinical trial, and we got to figure out how do we get that safety AE back into our safety data or our EDC database. So that's what our workflow looks for when we're talking about pharmacovigilance. Now, if we're talking about coding, we got the adverse events, we got medical history. Those two are going to get shipped off, and someone's going to look at it and code it to WHO drug, right, or Medra. If it's a drug or medication, it's going to go off and get coded in probably WHO drug. Someone's going to be sitting there and trying to decide, is this an auto-coded term or is this a manual coded term? Auto-coded means that someone's actually sitting there and we've already looked at this, we've made some type of decision in advance that this term means X, right? So that will go through. If it's manual, someone actually looks it up and says, okay, this is what it is. Once that AE gets coded, it gets pushed back to EDC. At a certain point, we're going to ask PV to review those codings to make sure that they're coded appropriately. Now, when we got our medical monitor has to look at everything, right? So all AEs that are entered in the database, right? So some of the tools that they'll use are probably like data listings. There might be visualizations tools, so like Spotfire or JReview that people might look. And then some of us will even pull things like TLFs and look at those to see if you can start seeing trends. But what is the AE review really looking for? It's really expectedness, right? Or one of the things I should say is expectedness, right? Is this AE anticipated or not, right? And if it's unanticipated, there's a whole nother set of activities that have to happen to figure out what are we going to do about that. And then they're looking at it for trends. They're looking at the AEs from clinical sense. Does this actually make sense, what's being entered into the database, right? And so all of that's being entered. They might have questions. So they're going to create a query, which is just a question, right, that they're going to enter into the EDC, hopefully they'll enter it in the EDC database, and then we'll get an answer back. Now, if you're lucky enough to have adjudication, which means you're probably working on some type of cardiovascular study, when AEs get entered into the system, you're going to have, at the very beginning, we're going to have a charter that says, these are the events that we're going to want to look at. These are the terms that we're going to want to look at. That gets agreed upon up front. At this point, a committee will get set up to review those things. Additionally, what may happen is the medical monitor, they might ask, we have something weird happening on this event. Can you also take a look at this? So all of that's happening. But from a system point of view, we have the AEs going back into the database, the collection, this person is now collecting source data, they're creating a dossier, they're writing narratives, they're sending it for CEC review, and then they're collecting results. So I'm gonna skip back, my slides are slightly out of order. So sometimes one person is doing all of this in some organizations. Other times there are different departments doing these things. So it becomes very confusing when you're talking to somebody about what they mean, right? And what's ultimately important is if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done, right? So a lot of times you're doing the work, but you're not getting credit, which is just as bad. So people create documentation. And I'm sure you all have seen a spreadsheet with all these multiple colors on it that mean different things when you're trying to track your AEs, right? You might have a tracker for your SAEs. You might have a tracker for AEs of special illustrators, adjudication, coding, all of these different things you're just tracking in an Excel spreadsheet going down and making sure that everything's been done. Right, and then we still can't forget about SAE reconciliation. We got two different databases. We got to figure out, do they match? We got to figure out if they mismatch, what's going to change, right? So that we can get all the data reconciled. So talking a little bit about technologies, and some of you guys might know some of these names. A while ago, long time ago, I remember getting called in Thomas's office and he's like, Hodge, we need a safety database. And I'm like, okay. And then Linda comes along and she's like, we need coding too. And I said, sure. Let me go get some RFPs. We documented all the requirements and the things like that. But we didn't understand all those processes that we were talking about, right? So I ended up spending $500,000 and having nothing to show for it but requirements, right? Lesson learned. So when we're talking about pharmacovigilance or SAE safety review, that's when we're really talking about Argus, ARIS-G, right? Things that I think we have to remember when we're talking about SAEs is that when you're building those type of solutions, it's important really to limit the number of data integrations that you're gonna have. Because of the fact that if you talk to PV, I'm going to tell you they're going to give you a list of every data point in the database. They're going to want the demographics. They're going to want the medications. They're going to want the ComMeds. They're going to want hospitalization, anything that they can possibly get. You say you want it, they're going to say, yes, I please. What makes that bad is each clinical trial is an independent database. So if you create all of these integrations, all these data points, you end up having to do that every single time you're trying to bring up a study, and you need to be really able to collect your SAEs on day one. So it's really important, I think at this point, really to limit the number of data integrations. Also equally important is really standardizing your EDC CRFs, right? If they're consistent, it's easier at that point to do your integrations. Another tool that you might consider if you're doing EDC is SAE reports, right? You can have initial SAE report, which is gonna have basically say, give me your site, give me your subject, and the SAE ID that you're looking for, and it can pull this information for you, your AE information, your comments, vital signs, demography, and so forth. Now, you run that report on January 1st. It's now January 10th. And so you want to know PV's now going to want to know what's changed between January 1st and January 10th. And this is where you can have this SAE report that there's a follow-up report. It's going to ask those same parameters that you initially did, but they're going to add on a second one the last time you ran that report. And then if you get a report like this, you can have it highlight what's changed. So that instead of the PV consultant spending 2 hours trying to figure out that the only thing that changed was the date of birth, and it was 1976 and it changed to 1975, they'll be able to run a report and immediately see, okay, this is the value of change and make their assessment off of that. Some people might say, what about integrating EDC with the safety database? there's only really, in my opinion, if you guys can tell me someone else, I'd like to know. I've only seen 2 companies do this, and I call it partially, and that's Metadata, right, and Omnicom. Their safety gateway and the safety link. And what that's doing, those 2 solutions, what they do is they really have an E2B solution. And so they've created a customized way where you can go through a GUI, pull all the fields out that you want, and then actually push it over into your safety database. What's nice about this is it does get rid of your SAE reconciliation, because you know that whatever came from your EDC database to your SAE to your safety database is consistent. But it only works for 2 studies or 2 trial platforms, Metadata Rave and Omnicom Trial Master. When you're setting up your CRS, one of the things that you can also do to kind of set yourself up for E to B is actually, because when we take AEs in the system, we take them one at a time. There's AE1, AE2, AE3. However, when you're talking about an SAE, AE1 and AE2 might be connected. And so this is where you can actually start creating cases and saying this SAE is related to these 2 AEs. And so you can collect your information, your standard information on your adverse event form, and then on your SAE, this is where you would actually say, okay, what's the AE that's associated to it? You can ask your seriousness criteria questions, any relationships, your SAE description, all of that stuff can kind of get added into onto that form. So coding, at this point, most coding systems, you're gonna find that they have a module that's associated to the EDC database. So you're gonna see stuff come in from adverse event, medical coding medications, like we talked about earlier. Did I get louder? So you'll see those type of things kind of come into play. But what's important to realize is that there's also coding that's occurring in your safety database. And sometimes they're not done in the same coding platform. So when you're doing your reconciliation, there's things you have to kind of consider, right? Who does your coding? Is it the medical monitor? Is it PV? Do you got a CRO or some third-party vendor that they're using? Who does that? Also, who's doing the reviewing? Who's maintaining your synonym list? Who's maintaining your thesaurus? Making sure that you have those type of things clearly defined up front in terms of how you're going to manage your list. Because sometimes you're also going to have therapeutic specific synonym lists. So you're going to have to kind of figure out how you want to handle that. And then equally important is, I think, when you start really negotiating with your PV team, is making sure you understand from an SAE perspective, one of the data points that we're going to look at is coded, and that's one of the key points that we're going to actually match on. And so you need to agree up front what is the business rule? Are we going to change the EDC data to match what's happening in the safety database, or are we going to go vice versa? And so those decisions, I think, need to occur before you start reconciling, because otherwise you end up in a match of, or war of wills of, I don't want to change my data because it means too much work for me right now, right? And so we have to kind of have those conversations up front as we're building out our processes. So talking about adjudication, I think what's interesting is, like, if you're looking at industry tools, what you really see is that there's AG-MetNet out there. They have the Judy platform. There's Web EAS, and then there's also CROs have all their own solutions. When you start approaching this, I think one of the things you have to understand is your strategy. It's like, understand your workflow. Up front, if you're going to go and do this, is who collects your source documents, who's writing your narratives, who's sending over your packets to your CEC, the frequency. Are you using, what type of CEC model are you using? Are you using to agree, and if they agree, they move forward, and only if one disagree, then it goes to the final? Are you going by committee? Those decisions have to be kind of figured out up front, even before you really kind of go and say, okay, this is the solution I want to use. You need to understand also here, it's like, okay, what is your CEC chart and what events you're planning to look? So there should be thought that goes into your adjudication, and it shouldn't just be kind of an afterthought thought, oh, we need adjudication, and then go off and run on that. So there's I call this is the poor man's way of doing adjudication when you don't have any money, you can't buy a system, is I've seen people build an EDC database just to do adjudication. And you can do that. You can also do it within your study, the use of roles and view restrictions to do this. A lot of it, you can have custom programming built into your solution, depending upon the type of CEC that you set up. But what's really challenging about this is that you really have to have an expert programming team, right? This isn't just out of the box, let's just click here, and you got a form. The other limitations on this is really, I think, when you start thinking about your study timelines, right? We got to get that study out the door yesterday. And we don't have time necessarily to wait to finish off the adjudication and form CRS and stuff like that. And the other thing is that when you're doing it in your EDC solution, you're only really collecting the results, right? So you're not getting the front end support of sort of data collection, creating your dossier, redacting, and all the things that you may get in a more full-blown tool. So to me, one of the things that's really missing from our current technology landscape is really supporting the clinical safety monitor. How are they supposed to document that they've done their adverse event reviews, right? One option, two option is EDC. You can add your CRF, your questions onto your AE CRFs, and someone can kind of go in there and manually do this. Challenges when you're kind of just adding questions on your AE CRFs, you can use views restrictions so that the site can't see your questions and only the sponsor can. But think about it from the CSM perspective. Every single time there's an AE, they got to go into that AE, make their update. And remember, we don't make updates once. That's why they like Excel spreadsheets, because they can go to the record and just make the update there. So they're constantly having to go back and make those updates. Right. You have other options where you can actually separate this form out with basic AE information. Once again, I say basic. It doesn't mean that you should go out there and recreate the entire study, but people are going to have to go find information. This tends to be a little bit more technically difficult. And I think what it is we also have to just be very real with the fact that the CSM is still going to have to move around and look at stuff within the database. There's other alternatives that I've really seen people do. I've seen people use SharePoint to track their AEs. I've seen CTMS be used as a tool for that. I've seen people use business intelligence tools and also some visualization tools. But really, I think at this point, when I look at it, there is really no leading tool that you can point to that says, okay, this is the way that we can actually, from a clinical safety monitor, conduct AE review. Right? And then I think what's also key here is that we have to remember to document your review and a validated solution. So in conclusion, I think what I hope you guys really get out of this is that AEs are complex, right? You got multiple things happening with that AE. It's not just, oh, it's going to the safety team or it's going here. If you ever get that phone call that says, hey, we need a safety database, make sure you understand what you're talking about, right? Because a lot of times you'll get called in by the director and we're like, we need a safety database. And they might be talking about reconciliation. They might be talking about what's being captured in EDC. They might be talking about triaging. You just never know what people are talking about until you really get to the crux of it. But you have to really break it down to one of those four pillars to understand that you can at least get to start framing the questions and understanding what somebody wants. And lastly, I think it's really important to keep your solution simple. Don't overcomplicate, don't do a lot of data integrations. Keep life simple for yourself because it'll just be easier in the long run. And so that's the end of my presentation. We will have questions a little later. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Bethany and she'll take us through a case study.
Hi, good evening. I want to thank Viva for hosting us and also Emanate for asking me to be here this evening and talk to you about my experiences with integrating safety data with EDC. It's remarkable to me that in this day and age, it's 2018, and we still collect data in 2 different databases. We have our EDC system, or a clinical database, and we have a safety database. And it was mentioned earlier that I teach at San Francisco State. There's a clinical trials design and management course that I teach the safety monitoring unit. And the students are so boggled by the concept of 2 separate systems. And it makes sense. We just haven't come to have the technology available yet to be able to integrate the information appropriately so it's able to solve all of the issues. But one effort is to think about, oh, maybe I'm not doing this correctly. Miss Sarah?
It stopped.
Oh yeah, you can go. The disclaimer is just that I will be talking about, what's that? Try it again. Perfect, thanks. I'll be talking about metadata and some other systems, Argus, for example, and OSG, and I'm not speaking from their perspective. I am my own independent person. But being in pharmacovigilance for 20 years, I always had a dream that there would be some way to integrate the information so we weren't having to go through this horrific reconciliation effort. And so working at a mid-sized biotech company, this was about 7 years ago, we really thought about the possibility of integrating information from a clinical trial system into the safety database. So we had 2 objectives, and it's important to think about the spectrum when someone says, let's integrate data between drug safety and the EDC. There's a couple of different objectives you could consider, and there's a large spectrum. So we wanted the biggest bang for our buck, which would be the full size of the spectrum. We wanted to reduce or eliminate, if possible, the need for SAE reconciliation. So that's the reconciliation between the clinical database and the safety database. But we also wanted to reduce the database data entry efforts on the drug safety side. So as Haj was saying, when the information comes into your pharmacovigilance department, there's a whole host of people that are sitting there literally entering the information that's received from the EDC or perhaps on a paper SAE form, heaven forbid. They're entering that information into a safety database. So if we're able to integrate the information, pull information from the EDC and push it into the safety system, could we potentially meet both of these objectives so that we don't have our safety staff having to rekey information in? So those were our goals. So how do we begin a project like this? We were relatively new on the scene in terms of this concept of integration. So I went around and interviewed all of my friends, all of the drug safety colleagues, heads of operations departments at 10 Bay Area companies, and said, how are you guys doing this? For all of your clinical trials where you're using EDC, how are you getting information from the EDC into the safety database? And it was remarkable to me how many companies were still using paper SAE forms. There was only one company that had used a concept of like a patient profile where they were pulling some information from the EDC into a report that then would be used by the safety team to enter information. But no one had really addressed this integration concept. So if you think about the different concepts, if you generate an electronic SAE form for the completion by the site, we're not solving either of our objectives. That doesn't help with reconciliation because it's a separate form. And that doesn't help us with having to rekey the information into the safety database. If we generate an electronic SAE form from the EDC, that doesn't meet objective number 2. So we're pulling information from the EDC, that's good. We may not have to do as much reconciliation because the data is coming directly from EDC, but it doesn't meet our objective of number 2 of not having to rekey into the safety database. If we incorporate the SAE form fields into the EDC, and then print the data and enter it into the safety database, again, we meet our first objective about not having to deal with reconciliation or reduce reconciliation, but we're not meeting objective number 2. So we quickly found out the only way to meet our objectives would be to figure out a way to incorporate the SAE form fields into EDC, so revise the way the CRFs are built around AE collection, and then figure out a way to electronically transfer the data from the EDC system into the safety database. So that meant no more paper SAE form. That meant no more screenshots of the EDC system. There are actually many companies out there where the drug safety team goes into EDC and takes screenshots of what's been entered and then rekeys that into the safety database. So if we don't have a concept of an SAE form, there's specific areas that are typically needed for drug safety reporting that hadn't in the past been captured in EDC. For example, a narrative, a description of what's going on with the patient. What is the clinical story going on with that particular event? What were the non-serious adverse events that led up to this potentially? What were the signs and symptoms that led up to this SAE? The rationale for causality assessment. Okay, well, we have a drop down, right, for related, not related, but what was the rationale behind that causality assessment? How do we identify co-suspect medications? That's something typically on a paper SAE form that the site would identify. How do we know what were relevant labs? How do we know which co-suspect medications, what ConMeds were relevant to that particular event? What medical history is relevant to the event? We don't want all the medical history. We don't necessarily need all the ConMeds. What's relevant to this particular SAE? And then we're used to having a signature from the PI. Do we still need that in this world of no paper SAE form? So how do we do it? Well, you have to create some sort of a dynamic form. We'll have to have a way to pull ConMeds, medical history, dosing, demographics, site contact info, maybe hospitalization info if that's on a separate CRF, patient disposition, are they still on study? If they withdrew, did they stop drug? If they stopped drug, did they withdraw? Is there a mortality CRF? So there's all these other interfaces essentially of data that is needed by your drug safety team that's collected on other CRFs, and we'd have to figure out a way to get that data as well. There's other process considerations that are specific just to drug safety. So we have a concept of day zero. And for those that aren't aware, that's the time clock that starts when an SAE is reported. So at the point that the SAE is reported, the pharmacovigilance department or drug safety department has anywhere from 7 to 15 days to evaluate and potentially submit an event that's considered related and unexpected. And the time point of that day zero is critical to be able to prove in an inspection, in a regulatory inspection. So we have to make sure that there's a way to document when what that day zero is. How will drug safety be notified if we're going to be collecting all of this in the EDC? And what about source docs? Some drug safety teams really like to see the discharge summaries. How are we going to collect that if we're collecting all of our SAE information for drug safety in the EDC? How do we determine what's considered relevant follow-up information? How will day zero be determined for that follow-up information? And what happens when events are deleted or perhaps downgraded from serious to non-serious? And then who's responsible for querying? So before all this, there was not really a comfort level of having drug safety personnel in the EDC entering in queries. So how do we make sure that we collaborate amongst departments to make sure that we're consolidating our queries, but also meeting the needs that each of us have to be able to meet our own regulatory requirements? So the other objective is getting the information into the safety database. So when should the data be sent over? And what if, for example, what if the concomitant medication CRF hasn't been entered yet? That would be a rate limiter for the collection of this information for safety. And which data should we send over? What's considered relevant? The E2B file, which is ultimately the file that is utilized to import into the drug safety database, there's mapping challenges. So how do we ensure that the non-E2B fields are being handled? And then once we receive the E2B file, it's fine for an initial report because it has all the initial SAE information, but what happens for a follow-up? How do you implement that and upload that into your drug safety database? The drug safety databases at this time, we're not really super savvy with receipt of XMLs or E2B files, so they weren't designed to be able to integrate this data coming in from EDC. So just to give you some background on this case study, it was a global study. It was the company's first EDC trial. So everyone was kind of drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, in this concept of technology moving from paper to EDC. We expected to have about 500 SAEs. And we already had a pretty strong SAE reconciliation process in place. We did implement objectives 1 and 2, which I'll talk about, and the technologies that we utilized were metadata rave and metadata safety gateway in collaboration with ARISG and their AG exchange module. So this is kind of a complicated slide, but just to kind of help everybody understand, the site's entering information into rave. If the event is considered serious, then it's going to go into this kind of holding tank, which is considered safety gateway for metadata rave. And then it will get ported over as an XML file into the ARISG database. That was the design. And then once it's in ARISG, then the pharmacovigilance department could do what they needed to do to meet their regulatory reporting requirements. So we had to collect information on what we now started to call an AE-SAE CRF. So we had the typical fields that you'd see on an AE CRF, in addition to all the things that you would have to have for an SAE. So that would be hospital admission discharge dates, the event narrative that we talked about, the ability to capture multiple events in one case. So to be able to relate multiple SAEs, if there's one hospitalization but multiple serious adverse events, we wanted the site to be able to link those and be able to tell one story rather than having to repeat it. Provide the causality rationale, relevant labs, co-suspect medications, and PI signature, all those things that we would typically have on a paper SAE form that we hadn't seen being present in a CRF with an EDC. We had to take into consideration all the data that was captured on other CRFs, so ConMeds, med history, dosing, demographics, vital signs, date and cause of death. All of those things would typically be re-entered on a paper SAE form. So we needed that information to be pulling from the other CRFs to be able to give a full picture for SAE reporting purposes. And we needed to develop a process for the source documents to be emailed if they were required. So then we needed to talk about queries. Did we feel comfortable with drug safety entering queries on the SAE portions or the data that's specific on the AECRF? Do we allow drug safety to be able to review and close those? And are we collaborating with our data management colleagues? And if for whatever reason the queries are not being responded to, can we leverage our site monitors to be able to get those resolved? We also needed to have a contingency plan because the SAE reporting is very clear. GCP requires that investigators are submitting this information within 24 hours. What if the EDC is down? So we had to have a backup process where there's a paper SAE form available until the EDC is back up and running. So in order to meet our objective number 2, we've got all the information getting pulled out of the EDC. How do we get it into the safety database? It did result in some changes actually to the AECRF because we had to add the additional fields and then we had to map all that information into a workable E2B. In terms of addressing our day 0, we had the technology of Safety Gateway that we were utilizing, which kind of solved that problem. Safety Gateway essentially acts as a holding tank for all of the information that's coming in for a particular SAE, and then you can define at what point you want to pull that over to the safety database. So we made some decisions that we were only going to check that information once each business day, so that if the site was going in and making changes to the CRF throughout the day, we weren't getting repeated notifications of the information as it was being updated through the day. And we decided not to use notification emails as well because we thought that that was overkill. And again, sometimes those notifications are fired multiple times during the day every time the site is clicking save on the AECRF. So it sounds good, is it too good? Trust me, there's always a catch, right? Oh, this is a fantastic solution and it's all going to be super easy. Well, it's not, obviously. It requires a sincere amount of collaboration from all the different stakeholders, from your data management team, from your IT team, from your pharmacovigilance team, your clinical operations team. And everyone has to be in agreement that you're basically changing the rules. You know, we've kind of historically been in our own little silos. You know, drug safety is just the SAE people. They get their information and they tinker in the safety database and they spit out the med watches, and that's their role. And we, you know, the industry has, the regulators have required us to expand that concept. You think about the aggregate reports that are required now, to develop a DSUR, for example, or a PSUR, it requires all of our functions to be working collaboratively. So making sure that we're all taking into consideration each other's expectations. It also required drug safety to have more input than had happened in the past. So even in a small company, there needs to be drug safety expertise that's leveraged for the evaluation and the selection of the EDC vendor, because we would need to ensure that this particular technology would work and that we could ask the right questions to make sure that it was going to be workable based on our objectives. Looking at contracts, the CRF design is a huge one. Looking at the edit checks, because now this is our data too. The information is coming in. We're utilizing the EDC as the vehicle for collection of SAE data for the safety database. So the edit checks become something that drug safety needs to comment on as well. Query flow, kind of redefining the rules of what data management is doing versus what drug safety is doing versus what the clinical monitor is doing. Role configurations, participating in user acceptance testing, et cetera. And then if there's a change to the CRF, the AE-CRF or any of the other ancillary CRFs that have data that are going to be pulled into the safety database, that then could affect the mapping. So it became this ongoing effort that we didn't necessarily realize that even after it had originally been set up, we're continuing to work together on any of the changes that might be happening with the EDC. We did find that training was our best way to communicate all of the issues and to make everyone aware about making sure that, for example, the CRFs are completed in a timely manner. Now it became critical at the investigator meeting to tell investigators, you have to fill out the ConMed CRF and the medical history CRF before you fill out your AE CRF, or the information isn't going to pull correctly. We also wanted to help them understand, especially the investigators, for example, about how this is simplifying the process. We're making your job easier, the investigator's job easier, by not having to fill out a separate form. But there's other things to keep in mind to be able to do that. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
So Haj and Bethany, thank you so much. We're going to have a time of question and answer. And this gives you the opportunity with the presentations to ask any of the questions to Haj or Bethany that you might have had during their presentation, or something having to do with specifically in your job area. I'm going to give that to them. I'll walk around with a microphone, and if you have a question, I'll give it to you to ask so everyone can hear.
Hi, so great presentation, both of you. One of the things that I was wondering, if you have an AE that continues, how do you deal with that in the EDC and pulling it over? You know, how is that managed, I guess?
So it would be managed based on data field changes.
So you have, because each one, I think in one thing you had hospital admission date and discharge. Is that the admission for the AE, or is that the, I'm thinking of more in the device world where they have a procedure and, you know, so they may go into the hospital for that. And then if they have an AE afterwards, they may be hospitals or they may not be hospitals. Not always in the pharma world does that happen. But so how do you manage all those things?
So based on, your clinical study, you would design the fields that you require to collect, and admission and discharge dates may not be relevant to your safety team, but it's a conversation you'll want to have. And then in terms of adverse events that are ongoing for a long period of time, as soon as the outcome is revised by the site, if the patient does resolve or if that adverse event does resolve, then it would fire a follow-up report essentially to safety.
Is that a separate form, or is that part of the...
Nope, it's all part of the first one. So as soon as the data field is changed, it essentially triggers a follow-up report.
So how do you deal with how do you deal with how do you deal with missing data fields?
Same way we always do. We would utilize data management and site monitors to try to get that information into the EDC. But the trigger point would be the update of the structured field within EDC, which is basically the way we did it before. If you think about the paper world, it wasn't until they put pen to paper and decided to, hit send on the fax machine for the information to come over.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. Very nicely done. I have a two-part question. I guess the first part is integration means different things to different people. And it seems to me in this instance, Bethany, what you're describing is the desire to use data that have been collected through the standard EDC system, but not necessarily editing or changing those data.
That's correct.
But you do want the ability to, by the writing of narratives and the putting together of the story that you mentioned, you want your own space to be able to record notes that will link back to those data, but those notes don't then become part of the EDC. They're just linked to them. Is that correct? Well, or are you pushing those notes back into an empty space in the EDC system?
No, we would want, so if the site has the opportunity to explain what's going on with the patient and kind of give us the clinical picture, we would want those notes to come over into the safety database. But then the safety personnel will write their own narrative that culminates all the information into a story that can be submitted to regulators, to the FDA, for example.
So within the EDC, you're going to give a blank CRF to the site personnel to describe everything happening?
Exactly. We call it the event description, or the SAE event description section.
Okay. And the second part of the question is, you also both of you talked about reconciliation. And again, reconciliation can mean different things to different people. I've been in clinical studies in which there was a deliberate desire to record separately what the investigator's opinion was of an adverse event, different, and it may be different than what the clinical endpoint committee, who had access to all of the entire history, plus all the imaging, the x-rays, the CT scans, what the clinical endpoint committee ruled on that particular adverse event. And there may be a difference, and that difference, as an analyst, that difference itself is important. There was no desire to change the investigator's mind by saying, oh, that thing that you reported isn't really what you reported. This group of individuals who have been designated as the clinical endpoints committee now say that you were wrong, it is now this. So in that case, there's a deliberate absence of reconciliation, and we're perfectly fine with that.
Absolutely. So I was more referring to the reconciliation that's required between the data that was entered into the EDC and whatever is entered into the safety database for the same event. So an event of pneumonia is collected in EDC, and then eventually it's entered into the safety database.
If it's serious.
If it's serious. And depending on what mechanism was designed for the SAE to come into the safety database, in the old world it was a paper form, there would need to be reconciliation between the two databases to make sure that what's in the safety database, we have 15 events, for example, 15 serious events. Does the clinical database have the same 15 serious events?
Right. And the onset and the relatedness would have to be
Exactly.
reconciled as well.
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Right, we have probably enough for one more question. It's getting close to 7:30 and we want to be sensitive to your time because we know it's been a long day for many of you. So if anybody has one last question. Going once. Well, thank you all so much. We definitely appreciate you coming to this event and for supporting Viva and Emanate. I'm going to have Haj close it for us. And
Like going on mic.
yeah.
So we want to let everybody know that we do have another webinar coming up on adjudication, endpoint adjudication. It'll be on September 12th, and this will be with Criterion Edge. So be on the lookout. We'll be promoting this very soon. And then we just want to thank you guys for all attending. Thank you.